In March 1969, a jewelry establishment in downtown Chicago was burglarized of $1.5 million in valuable stones, including an 8-carat rose diamond worth $500,000. The perpetrators vanished without a trace. The authorities suspected an inside operation, but no arrests were made and the case was closed the subsequent year. For decades, the stolen gemstone remained missing. In 2023, a routine stone scan at a Detroit pawn store triggered a match in an old insurance registry. After 54 years, the trail suddenly reappeared, and with it, long-concealed secrets. On the evening of March 14, 1969, just minutes before closing time, an elegant jewelry boutique on North Michigan Avenue in Chicago became the scene of one of the city's most audacious and professionally executed robberies. At approximately 5:50 p.m., two individuals entered the boutique, a man and a woman, both dressed in what appeared to be the official uniform of a courier company. The boutique, known for serving elite clientele, was unusually quiet that evening. Only two employees were present, the manager and an armed security officer stationed near the rear entrance. This minimal staffing was standard procedure for the final minutes before weekend closure. The woman presented a clipboard with shipping documents and what appeared to be official paperwork, authorizing the pickup of select items for transport to an exclusive auction event scheduled in New York the following week. The documentation included the store's letterhead, falsified signatures, and itemized lists of high-value pieces, all consistent with previous legitimate shipments. While the manager examined the documents, the woman maintained his attention by confidently explaining the supposed urgency of the transfer. As this discussion continued, her partner moved deeper into the store under the pretense of preparing for packaging. Without warning, he produced a firearm and immediately took the security officer at gunpoint. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Keeping the weapon trained on the officer, the man ordered both employees to remain calm and follow instructions. The threat was clear and immediate. Under the pressure of imminent violence, the manager was forced to open the boutique's secure storage room, which housed the most valuable jewelry pieces under lock and key. Inside the room, stored in padded metal cases and custom velvet-lined trays, were dozens of items: necklaces, rings, bracelets, and earrings encrusted with diamonds, emeralds, rubies, and sapphires. One particular piece stood out: a rare 8-carat rose diamond set in a platinum ring valued at approximately $500,000. This stone was not only extraordinary in clarity and hue, but also featured a microscopic crack that made it uniquely identifiable. The gem had been registered in insurance databases due to its exceptional characteristics and appraised value. It was the centerpiece of the boutique's collection. Under the watchful eye of the armed man, the manager loaded selected items, including the rose diamond, into the same container referenced in the falsified documents. The operation was precise and swift. The woman assisted by confirming item numbers aloud, cross-referencing the fake manifest. Within 11 minutes, the container was sealed and the boutique's most valuable merchandise, totaling approximately $1.5 million, had been extracted. Before exiting, the perpetrators forced the manager and the officer into the boutique's back office, a secure administrative space typically used for inventory documentation and closing procedures. There, they ordered both men to remain silent and restrained them using metal shelf brackets and zip ties. The phone line in the room had been cut, rendering communication with the outside world impossible. The office had no windows to the street, only a locked door leading to the main floor. Once the employees were secured, the two imposters exited the boutique through the service corridor. This route led to a staff-only exit in the alley behind the building, commonly used for vendor deliveries and garbage removal. The street outside remained quiet. No pedestrians or drivers appeared to notice anything unusual. The entire operation had taken less than a quarter of an hour. Inside the office, the manager and the officer spent the next half hour working to free themselves. Using the corner of a filing cabinet, the manager eventually dislodged the bracket securing his wrist and then freed the officer. With the phone line severed and no internal means of communication available, they were forced to act together. They unlocked the door using a backup key hidden under a floor tile, a precaution known only to senior staff, and re-entered the main store. After confirming the thieves were gone and that no one had returned, the manager exited through the front door and ran to a neighboring store where he borrowed a phone and placed an urgent call to the Chicago Police Department. Officers arrived within minutes and secured the scene. An initial inspection confirmed the worst. The boutique's entire high-value collection had been stripped, including the rose diamond. Detectives from the city's major crimes division launched an immediate investigation. Their first conclusion was inescapable. The robbery had been planned with insider-level knowledge. The thieves had known the boutique's closing schedule, the layout of the store, the location of the vault, and even the internal processes used for shipping. It was not a random hit, but a meticulously timed operation. Attention quickly turned to the small circle of employees with recent access to shipping records and vault codes. Over the following days, all boutique staff were questioned, including a delivery courier who had been fired just 3 weeks earlier after a dispute involving forged time cards. His alibi for the day of the heist was questionable, but physical evidence was lacking. The fragments of fingerprints recovered from the office and vault area were partial and inconclusive. Investigators combed pawn shops, auction houses, and international trading channels in search of the missing diamond, but it did not resurface. Insurance alerts were issued globally. Weeks turned to months, and no credible leads emerged. By early 1970, with no new evidence and no suspects formally charged, the case was marked inactive. The boutique had filed an insurance claim and received compensation. Public memory of the event faded quickly amid rising crime rates and shifting headlines. Yet somewhere, the rose diamond remained uncut, unlisted, and hidden from public view. It passed quietly into obscurity, untouched for decades. Its trail had gone cold, but its story was not over. In August 2023, inside a small storefront on the east side of Detroit, the routine pace of business was disrupted by a single object. A woman appearing to be in her late 70s entered the quick cash pawn store and approached the glass counter. She introduced herself as Gloria T. Dupree and removed a worn velvet pouch from her handbag. Inside was a gold ring set with a large rose gemstone. She calmly stated it was a family heirloom she wished to sell. The store's appraiser, Kevin Harris, had seen hundreds of pieces just like it, some real, some counterfeit, most of little consequence. At 35, with a decade of experience and recent training on the shop's newly integrated verification system, Kevin had adopted a more meticulous routine. Along with visual examination and standard stone tests, he now relied on a portable spectral scanner that cross-referenced high-resolution data with digital archives provided by the Gemological Institute of America and major insurance records. While the store rarely acquired high-value items, the device had been a required addition by their parent chain for due diligence. The ring setting was classic, unremarkable, but the gemstone's hue stood out, deep, vivid, and unusually bright. Kevin placed it under the scanner lens. The scan took only seconds. A sharp tone emitted from the device followed by a red-screened alert. A match had been identified. The data included serial classification, weight, color profile, and a microscopic crack near the base of the stone. Each a perfect match to an item reported stolen over 5 decades ago. The listing described a 2.1-carat fancy rose diamond taken during the infamous 1969 Chicago jewelry heist. Kevin's attention shifted back to the woman. She appeared increasingly anxious, her eyes fixed on the exit door. Her explanation of the ring being passed down in the family now sounded rehearsed. He noticed she avoided direct eye contact, clutched her handbag tightly, and frequently glanced at the counter clock. Instead of confronting her, Kevin calmly continued the process. He asked for identification, which she produced without protest. Her name matched the one she had given, Gloria T. Dupree. Kevin copied her driver's license details and used the shop's internal tablet to photograph the ring from multiple angles. He logged the transaction as pending verification, allowing him to delay payment under standard policy. When she asked whether the item would be accepted, Kevin told her it required advanced appraisal due to the stone's appearance. She nodded, left the ring behind, and exited the shop without further comment. Once the door shut behind her, Kevin locked the item in a secure back room. He saved the scanner results, screenshots, and identification images to the store's internal system and then contacted law enforcement. Instead of dialing emergency dispatch, he reached out to the city's property crimes division, where a specialized detective had previously visited to inform them of a cooperative program involving traceable assets. He described the result from the scanner and provided the corresponding case number, which linked directly to the historical record. The Chicago Police Department's archive database confirmed the diamond's origin, item number 1127, last seen in a robbery that resulted in the disappearance of over $1.5 million worth of jewels. The rose diamond had been among the most sought-after items ever stolen in the city, long assumed to be sold off internationally or recut to avoid detection. Its resurfacing, unmodified and intact, was both rare and significant. Within hours, 2 local officers visited the shop, requested the documentation Kevin had prepared, and sealed the ring in an evidence bag. The pawn shop retained a copy of the woman's ID and transaction record, all submitted with the official report. Detectives in Detroit, in cooperation with the Chicago Cold Case Unit, now had a lead. While ownership claims remained unverified and statute of limitations complicated direct restitution, the object itself was irrefutable evidence. Gloria Dupree had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, walked into a store with a stone that law enforcement had failed to locate for half a century. From a procedural standpoint, her appearance at the pawn shop triggered a sequence of checks rarely activated. Most stolen items entering pawn circuits were mundane: watches, laptops, small electronics. This case was categorically different. The scanner had not only verified origin, it had verified continuity. The internal fault lines in the diamond, the unique pattern of inclusions, and the exact carat weight had been preserved. There was no doubt it was the same gem. What remained unclear was how a retired woman in Detroit had come into possession of an unrecovered asset from one of the most methodically executed robberies in Chicago's history. The timeline between the 1969 heist and the 2023 presentation spanned 54 years. The ring's condition, along with the absence of any tampering or recutting, suggested it had not been sold through conventional channels. It had likely remained hidden, untouched for decades. Investigators suspected that whoever had originally taken the gem had kept it out of circulation, possibly passing it down quietly within a private family network. The presence of Gloria's name on the transaction gave them a direction, but not an answer. The link between her and the 1969 robbery had not yet been established. She had no known criminal history, no past arrests, and no registered relatives with ties to Chicago in the late 1960s. Her address led to a modest home in a quiet residential neighborhood. She had not returned to the shop or attempted to inquire about the ring's status. For the investigators, this silence deepened the mystery. The physical evidence was now in custody. The woman who carried it remained free. But the resurfacing of the rose diamond, verified by digital tools that didn't exist when it was stolen, marked the first real movement in the cold case in over 50 years. The question was no longer about the ring's origin, it was about the path it had taken to get there, and law enforcement had just found their first thread. The Detroit police sent a tip to the cold case unit. A 54-year-old theft of over $1.5 million in jewels was no longer a historical entry in a database. It was active again. The case landed on the desk of Detective Carl Malone, recently promoted and known for his disciplined, methodical approach to historical crime analysis. Carl, in his early 30s, had a reputation for treating cold cases like puzzles with missing pieces that still fit somewhere. He began by accessing the 1969 case files stored on microfilm and digitized through the department's archival system. The Chicago robbery report had been detailed, the result of intense investigation at the time. He reviewed photographs of the crime scene, diagrams of the store's interior layout, statements from the 2 surviving staff members, and the master inventory of stolen items. Item number 1127, the rose diamond, had been marked in red ink with the notation, "Never recovered." Now it was in police custody, intact, unaltered, and definitively identified through spectral imaging and insurance records. To confirm the diamond's identity, Carl reached out to the insurer listed in the original theft documentation. The company still operated under a different name following mergers, but archival records had been preserved. The serial number etched into the gem by the Stone lab, as well as microscopic flaws catalogued at the time of appraisal, matched perfectly. No uncertainty remained. This was not a similar stone. It was the stone. Whoever had presented it at the pawnshop was either directly tied to the crime or had received it through a hidden chain of possession that had never surfaced publicly. Carl next turned his attention to the woman who had brought in the ring. The name on her identification, Gloria T. Dupree, appeared valid on first inspection, but the ID issued in Michigan was relatively recent. He submitted her photograph through a biometric recognition database used to assist in locating long missing persons and individuals living under false identities. The result came within minutes. The facial scan returned a match to a woman listed as Leah Holloway, born in Illinois in 1942. She had been employed by the U.S. Postal Service in Chicago in the 1960s and had disappeared from public records in 1969, the same year as the heist. This match reoriented the investigation. Leah Holloway had never been arrested, and her connection to the original robbery had not been documented, but her disappearance just months after the Chicago jewelry establishment had been cleaned out was no longer coincidental. Carl obtained a search warrant for her residence. 2 officers accompanied him to the listed address, a modest single-story home on a quiet block in Detroit's Jefferson-Chalmers neighborhood. The property was unremarkable, tidy, dated, with no visible security system. Inside, the decor was consistent with a woman living alone on a fixed income. Prescription bottles lined the kitchen counter, most dated within the last 3 months. There was no cash, no weapons, no trace of luxury. Carl moved room to room, cataloging every item of interest. In the bedroom dresser, he found several small pieces of old jewelry, mostly costume grade. But the most valuable find was a thick envelope of letters, bound with an elastic band and stored in the bottom drawer. One note, written in blue ink on aged paper, stood out. It was undated but had clearly been folded and unfolded many times. The signature read only E, and its tone was personal, urgent. One sentence had been underlined in pencil. "If things ever get tight, you know where our reserve is." Carl flagged the note for further analysis. The casual reference to a reserve suggested premeditation, possibly a plan for hiding stolen assets, but the signature E demanded identification. Back at the station, Carl reviewed records related to Leah Holloway's family. She had one known brother, Edwin Holloway, 2 years older, who had also vanished from official records in 1969. He had no recorded death certificate, no Social Security activity since that year, and no trace of employment after the fall of 1968. Carl accessed federal name change databases, searching for any men born in Illinois between 1939 and 1943 who had obtained new identities in the 1970s. After cross-referencing a handful of records, he focused on one, Marcus Reed, born 1941, registered in Atlanta, Georgia since 1975. No tax filings prior to that year. No previous identification under that name. The man had bought a used car in 1976, purchased a home in a low-income neighborhood in 1978, and worked sporadically in construction. But his DMV photo, updated in 2021, raised alarm. The bone structure, ears, and mouth matched a 1966 photo of Edwin Holloway from an employment file Carl had pulled from the archives. It was a near certain match. The implications were immediate. If Marcus Reed was Edwin Holloway and Leah Holloway was living under a false name as Gloria Dupree, then the heist had been more than an opportunistic crime. The diamond's reappearance wasn't random. It suggested that the original thieves had never left the country, never laundered the goods through international markets, and had instead hidden the most valuable pieces, perhaps all of them. The note about a reserve now took on critical meaning. Carl compiled a report and escalated the case to a joint task force involving federal investigators. The Rose Diamond had surfaced. The woman who brought it in had been identified as someone who vanished during the investigation of the robbery. And now there was a possible sighting of another original suspect still alive under an alias in a different state. What had once been a legendary unsolved case was now turning into an active investigation. Carl wasn't chasing ghosts. He was following real names, real addresses, and real paper trails, and the deeper he dug, the more it became clear this wasn't over. Detective Carl Malone landed in Atlanta 2 days after confirming the alias. The local authorities provided surveillance and background checks on Marcus Reed, who had lived under that name since 1975. His life appeared deliberately uneventful. Officially, he owned a small home repair business that serviced mostly elderly clients in suburban neighborhoods. His income history was sparse but consistent, and he had never filed for bankruptcy, appeared in court, or drawn the attention of any agency in nearly 50 years. His fingerprints, however, told a different story. The biometric match to Edwin Holloway was conclusive, leaving no legal room for denial. A subpoena followed, and soon after, Marcus Reed, now legally identified as Edwin Holloway, was brought in for questioning. The interrogation was conducted in a secure room at the Atlanta Police Department, with Carl leading the session and a federal agent observing from behind the glass. Edwin Holloway, now in his early 80s, entered the room slowly but without resistance. He declined legal representation at the outset, stating that there was no point denying anything anymore. The forensic match on the diamond, the rediscovered letter addressed to E. In his sister's home, and his own photographic comparison had left him with few options. He acknowledged his true identity within the first hour. The confession did not begin with the crime, but with the circumstances that led to it. Edwin spoke not with bravado, but with the tone of someone revisiting decisions made in desperation. He described the late 1960s as a time of suffocation. Both he and his younger sister Laya had been stuck in low-paying, monotonous jobs that left little hope for change. Edwin worked for a freight shipping company near the south side of Chicago, often loading crates for hours at a time without overtime pay or stability. Laya, employed at a local post office, sorted mail in 12-hour shifts, returning home to a cold apartment and unopened bills. They were intelligent and observant, but their talents remained unnoticed, buried beneath routine and disappointment. The idea to rob the jewelry establishment had not come from greed, he said, but from exhaustion. Their goal had never been luxury or violence. They wanted a way out. According to Edwin, the plan began with details only someone in their positions could obtain. Laya had memorized delivery schedules from the post office, including which vendors used insured parcels. Edwin, meanwhile, had come across routing patterns from private security firms responsible for transporting valuable goods. A key piece of information came from an acquaintance of Edwin's, Ronald King, a part-time security officer who had briefly worked at the targeted establishment. King had mentioned the timing of vault deliveries and the layout of the office during casual conversation, not knowing it would later serve as the foundation of a heist. Edwin admitted that after the robbery, the siblings split the stolen jewelry and agreed to vanish separately. The rose diamond, far too recognizable and too heavily documented to risk selling, had been set aside as a fallback. It was never to be sold, only kept as a safeguard. He called it their insurance policy, and insisted they had both agreed on that from the start. After fleeing, he had relocated to Georgia, where he changed his name through informal channels and slowly built a new identity. They had kept no contact after 1972. The confession was detailed but not boastful. Edwin didn't attempt to conceal the decisions he had made. Instead, he emphasized how carefully he had tried to blend in with society. He had never reoffended, never spoken of the crime to anyone, and never used the diamond to fund his new life. His house, bank records, and vehicle history were examined. Nothing suggested he had lived beyond his modest means. Investigators found purchases consistent with someone earning under the national median income for 4 decades. A used pickup truck purchased in 1976 remained registered in his name until the early 2000s. Home maintenance tools, job invoices, and grocery receipts painted a portrait of a quiet, deliberate life. The more revealing question became why the diamond had resurfaced. Edwin had no clear answer, but detectives suspected Laya's declining health played a role. A review of her pharmacy purchases showed a recent shift toward palliative prescriptions. Her mail contained hospital appointment reminders, and a neighbor confirmed she had been taken to the hospital the previous week. She had not yet returned home. Investigators verified that she had been admitted to Detroit Receiving Hospital's cardiac care unit due to complications from long-standing hypertension. It appeared the decision to pawn the ring may have been prompted by either financial strain or a sense that she would not need it much longer. Given her hospitalization, no formal interview had taken place with Laya, only the earlier search of her residence. The letter signed by E remained a critical piece of evidence, as did her identification at the pawn establishment. Edwin's confession, although given voluntarily, was backed by decades-old data that further corroborated his account. He had no way of knowing that his sister still kept his letter or that the ring would surface at precisely the wrong moment. The timing, unintentional or not, reignited a case long thought to be buried. Carl compiled the transcript, annotated every financial verification, and cross-referenced names and locations from the original investigation. The 1969 heist had never been closed, only left dormant. Now with one confession, one recovered item, and one surviving participant unable to testify due to medical condition, the case was preparing to move from investigation to legal proceedings. But more questions remained. The diamond was only one item. What happened to the rest? And if Edwin's version was true, then Ronald King, once just a name in the background, might not have disappeared as easily as everyone had assumed. Following Edwin Holloway's confession, the Chicago Police Department undertook a complete forensic and procedural reconstruction of the 1969 heist. The planning phase, as Edwin detailed under sworn statement, began in late February 1969. Both he and Laya were living in Chicago at the time, working low-wage jobs with little stability. They spent nearly 2 weeks conducting surveillance on the boutique Laya posed as a job seeker and entered the establishment on at least 3 occasions, pretending to inquire about employment opportunities. Each visit allowed her to observe employee movement, opening and closing routines, and the layout of the back office. Edwin, posing as a pedestrian with a clipboard, walked the alley behind the boutique repeatedly to understand delivery patterns, exit routes, and blind spots. Their focus was always the same: minimal visibility, short-staffed hours, and the physical location of the vault. According to Edwin, it became clear that the final minutes before weekend closure offered the lowest risk of interruption. Crucially, access to internal security information came from Ronald King, a part-time security officer who had once worked weekend shifts at the boutique. Though he was never formally charged in 1969, his name appeared in early investigative files as someone who had left abruptly in February under unexplained circumstances. Edwin admitted that Ronald provided them with the vault code, floor schematic, and confirmation that the boutique would be lightly staffed on Friday evenings. In exchange, he received a cash payment in small bills. Ronald later disappeared from public records, and his current whereabouts remain unknown. The heist took place on March 14, 1969. That Friday, just before 6 p.m., Laya and Edwin arrived in a rented panel van using a rear delivery access road behind North Michigan Avenue. The vehicle was registered under a false name and had been rented using counterfeit documents. Both wore matching courier uniforms, standard blue jumpsuits with stitched logos they had fabricated using iron-on decals, and thrift store patches. The paperwork they carried included forged boutique letterhead, a shipping manifest listing over 30 pieces of jewelry, and a falsified manager signature copied from a returned receipt. Laya entered first, approaching the manager with a clipboard, while Edwin followed minutes later, pretending to conduct packaging preparation. According to Edwin, their goal was never to injure anyone. The weapon he carried was real, but unloaded. The entire plan relied on speed, psychological pressure, and the appearance of legitimacy. Once the manager was fully engaged with the shipping manifest, Edwin drew the revolver and directed the officer to move to the back office. The manager, stunned by the sudden escalation, complied with Edwin's demand to unlock the vault. Inside, as confirmed by original insurance records and Edwin's statement, were metal cases lined with soft padding containing the establishment's premium collection. Dozens of rings, necklaces, earrings, and brooches were sorted in velvet trays marked with item numbers. Among them was the rose diamond ring, the most valuable item in the boutique's inventory. The 8-carat stone had been stored in a standalone display box with internal cushioning and a coded label consistent with the manifest Laya carried the manager, believing the document to be legitimate until the moment of the robbery, handed over the exact items listed. Laya cross-checked item numbers as he loaded them into a reinforced transport case they had brought themselves. The actual transaction from vault opening to case sealing lasted under 7 minutes. After securing the goods, Edwin and Laya forced both employees into the administrative office and used shelf brackets and heavy-duty zip ties to restrain them. The establishment's internal phone line had already been severed. The office, shielded from outside visibility, provided them the necessary buffer to exit the building unseen. They left through the alleyway door and disappeared into traffic less than 15 minutes after entering. Police now confirmed that the abandoned van had been located the next day near an industrial storage yard on the south side. It had been wiped clean of fingerprints. Inside, only a torn decal from the fake courier company remained. Nearby dumpsters showed traces of burned clothing, consistent with uniforms. No surveillance existed at the time, but maintenance logs and garbage pickup records corroborated the timeline. The heist had been clean and efficient. Over the next 3 weeks, both suspects left Chicago. Edwin traveled west under a new identity while Laya went south. Investigators now believe they liquidated much of the stolen jewelry in small batches across different states. The items that lacked distinctive features were sold through pawn establishments and small dealers. Records recovered from state tax archives in Indiana and Missouri showed unusually large cash transactions involving vintage jewelry in the months following the heist. The total value recouped after fencing fees and dealer cuts was estimated at around $1 million, but the rose diamond had remained untouched. Laya, according to Edwin, had it reset into a different mount and stored it inside a vintage jewelry box hidden for decades. They had agreed never to sell it unless absolutely necessary. In Edwin's words, it was their silent insurance policy. Too risky to move, but too valuable to ignore. And in 2023, as circumstances changed, the gem finally resurfaced. In early 2024, nearly 55 years after the rose diamond vanished from a Chicago boutique, justice finally caught up with those responsible. The recovered stone had triggered a full-scale legal review, reopening a case that had once been declared inactive. At the center of the proceedings stood 2 names long buried in silence: Laya Holloway and Edwin Holloway. Their roles in the 1969 heist were no longer speculative or circumstantial. Their own actions in the present had exposed a history they had spent a lifetime concealing. Laya was the first to face legal consequences. Her attempt to sell the rose diamond in Detroit had not only identified the stolen stone, but also constituted a new prosecutable offense. According to Michigan law, possession and attempted sale of stolen property are not shielded by the statute of limitations when the object in question remains unreturned and its ownership unresolved. Prosecutors argued that Laya had knowingly retained stolen property for decades, and her recent attempt to profit from it showed a continued criminal intent. Laya's physical condition played a significant role in sentencing. At 77, she suffered from an advanced heart condition that required daily medication and restricted her mobility. In court, she appeared physically diminished, her posture hunched and movements labored. Though she did not offer a full confession, she acknowledged keeping the rose diamond hidden for decades and confirmed Edwin's role in the 1969 robbery. The court accepted her partial admission as sufficient grounds for conviction. The judge, weighing her age, declining health, and cooperation during the investigation, issued a lenient sentence. Laya was sentenced to 18 months of home confinement, during which she would be monitored electronically. She was also fined $10,000 payable in monthly installments. The court emphasized that while her punishment reflected humanitarian considerations, the severity of the crime itself was not forgotten. Her record would remain permanently marked. Edwin faced a much more severe outcome. Unlike Laya, he had evaded detection for decades under false identities, moved across state lines multiple times, and had failed to disclose his role in one of the most significant unsolved robberies in Chicago history. Although he eventually cooperated with authorities, prosecutors in Illinois argued that his crimes extended far beyond possession. Edwin had brandished a weapon during the original heist, impersonated a licensed courier, and obstructed justice by living under an assumed name. At 81, Edwin was formally charged in Cook County with armed robbery, forgery, and identity fraud. His case was tried in a state court in Chicago, where archival evidence, insurance records, and his signed confession were presented. Because Illinois law treats armed robbery as a Class X felony, the statute of limitations did not protect him. His attorneys requested leniency due to his age and declining memory, but the judge noted that Edwin had remained silent for over 5 decades, denying closure to the victims and benefiting financially from the crime. In February 2024, Edwin Holloway was sentenced to 6 years in state prison. He was transferred to a minimum security correctional facility equipped for elderly inmates. The sentencing drew national attention, with many commentators remarking on the unusual spectacle of an octogenarian facing prison for a crime committed before man had walked on the moon. But the court was unequivocal. Age did not erase accountability. The Rose Diamond itself, now appraised at $2.2 million, was returned to the insurance company that had paid out the 1969 claim. Under the terms of the original policy, ownership of the recovered item defaulted to the insurer. The stone was immediately placed under high-security custody and removed from public access. Whether it would ever be sold again remained unclear, but its legal status was now resolved. The rest of the stolen collection, necklaces, brooches, vintage earrings, was presumed lost forever. Edwin's testimony confirmed that many of the smaller pieces had been broken down, melted, or resold without documentation across state lines. Without unique identifiers or registered appraisals, they had slipped permanently into the anonymous underbelly of the jewelry market. The story became a media sensation. Local outlets in Detroit and Chicago ran investigative specials, tracing the case from the 1969 robbery to the present-day sentencing. National broadcasters picked up the narrative, framing it as a parable of justice delayed but not denied. Online, the story went viral. Viewers were captivated by the image of a dusty pawn establishment triggering a legal avalanche decades in the making. Kevin Harris, the pawnbroker who had flagged the diamond, received formal recognition from the city of Detroit. The mayor's office issued a public letter of commendation, praising his attention to detail and commitment to legal compliance. The quick cash pawn establishment became an unlikely symbol of civic responsibility, and Harris was briefly profiled in several national news features. As part of the broader investigation, the cold case unit in Chicago also reopened its inquiries into Ronald King, the former security officer who, according to Edwin, had provided insider information that enabled the heist. For months, investigators searched public records, social security registries, and even obituaries. Eventually, confirmation arrived. Ronald King had died in 1998 under a different name. He had moved to Arizona in the late 1970s, changed his legal identity through marriage and a clerical loophole, and lived out the rest of his life working as a building superintendent. He was never charged. His role in the robbery remained a buried secret until Edwin's confession brought it to light. With both surviving perpetrators held accountable, the case was formally closed in July 2024. The files were updated to reflect the successful recovery of the primary stolen item, the sentencing of both suspects, and the death of the third conspirator. After 55 years, the Chicago Police Department finally marked the case as resolved.